Okay, class. Today we're going to be talking about the origins of ultramarathons. Honestly, um, I was aware of like bits and pieces of ultramarathoning history. However, when I started to dig around, I realized, whoo, there's a lot. And it's quite expansive, which makes sense, right? We are human beings. We have spent more time moving around on our feet, quiet as it's kept, than we have moving around on wheels. So the history is vast, it's amazing, and it's all encompassing. And so as a result, I decided I'm going to do a video essay and I'm going to dig deep on the history of ultramarathoning, not only just in the US, but internationally. And so I'm super excited about that. And I'll be posting that video on the Conscious Gear YouTube channel. So look for that in the next week or so. And that's where it will be. But in the meantime, for this discussion today, we're just going to be talking about the early origins of ultramarathoning in the US only. So I'm super excited to be able to share with you guys some of this information I've been able to find, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay. Okay, so first I want us to start with what I call early influences to the whole ideal of long distance running. Okay. The first one is indigenous running traditions. Honestly, this is a no-brainer, right? Native Americans were here first. Of course, they would be able to contribute to this sport just naturally, right? Organically. But Native American tribes have a long history of running long distances. And they do it for various purposes, including hunting, communication, meaning that they delivered messages from tribe to tribe, across this country, as well as spiritual ceremony. Their endurance and knowledge of the land played a role in shaping early ultra marathoning. And it reminds me of a story that I just posted about the great Bunion Derbies, and which makes sense why the very first winner, who was Andrew Payne, he was a Cherokee. And so, of course, as a Native American, he knew the land. He probably knew the land way better than anybody else. So that's probably why he won. But also just because he came from a culture and a history of doing endurance, running, walking, moving, he just brought that natural tenacity to it. Also, as I was looking at the history, again, it's quite advanced, quite expansive. Um, there is a long history of Native Americans ultra running traditions. And this is particularly true among the Tarahumara and the Hopi peoples are Arizona folks. And so, and that all of this kind of traditions around long distance running predates any organized ultra marathons in the US. So, or any early organized European American events in the US. These long distance events or part of their community and culture was really a lot of it had to do with messaging, like I had mentioned before. And then also many were what they call ceremonial runs. So when we think about the early influences of ultramarathon, we really owe a lot of homage to our indigenous brothers and sisters. Now, the first documented American ultramarathon was in 1867 by Edward Payson Weston, where he went from Portland, Maine to Chicago. Now, that was a 1,326-mile trek, and he did it in 26 days, y'all. From what I understand, I guess there were some other people that ran the race as well, and he ended up winning $10,000. Yes. But what's interesting about the way they did the event back then is that he ended up receiving several death threats from gamblers, from people who had betted against him. They didn't think he was going to do it. They thought, oh, he would fail for sure, but he did. And also, it's reported that he was attacked once for winning, for actually making the trek from Portland, Maine to Chicago. That's kind of deep, y'all. But yeah, Edward Payson Weston, his name's going to come up over and over again, but he is the first documented. Not to say that there weren't other ultramarathoners. It's just that this was the first documented. Now, the second thing that happened in the 1870s, now, okay, this event happened in 1867, right? So he really was paving the way. And so what happens is in the 1870s, there became this, what they call pedestrianism craze, or what they call competitive walking or running. And it was incredibly popular. These events often held indoors, involved participants walking around tracks for days and days and days. The way the competition worked is that the last person standing was declared the winner. So it's interesting to think about people walking around the track over and over again. And then there's just in the bleachers a whole bunch of people watching them. I'm not sure how entertaining that was, but I guess back then it was. What was interesting about this craze is that it introduced the concept of extreme long distance events to the American public. And then shortly thereafter, in 1879, the first major competitive ultramarathon was held at Gilmore's Garden. I'm going to say this, there was a lot of stuff going on in the East Coast as it relates to ultramarathoning. Now, the Gilmore's Garden was later named Madison Square Garden. And this was a 6-day go as you please race where participants could run or even walk as much or as little as they wanted within the 6-day period. These 6-day races became super popular and they were great entertainment in the late 1800s. They drew thousands of spectators and professional athletes who would compete for significant prize money. Again, I'm going to bring him back up again. Edward Payson Weston competed, but he was beaten by Charles Rowell, who covered 530 miles in that 6 days. Now, another notable champion includes Patrick Fitzgerald. Just as a side note, Payson Weston was a prominent figure, and he was well-known pedestrian of the time. And when I use the word pedestrian, that means anybody that did a lot of walking, fast walking, or running. What we call runners now, that's what they called. They called us pedestrians back then. And he is largely credited with popularizing the sport of long distance walking, making this early ultramarathoning significant. All right, let's jump to the early 1900s. The Redwood Empire was a 30-mile race. They started this one in 1908. It was in California. It's one of the first organized trail ultramarathons in the US. So notice that the history is things are starting to shift, right? They went from kind of road or on the tracks to now we're on the trails. Then the first documented American ultramarathoner was Edward Payson again, because he completed not numerous ultra distance events. But what he is really most well known for is a transcontinental walk that he did in 1909. This dude was all about being a pedestrian, and his name will come up over and over again. Now, when we think about the first mountain trail ultramarathon, so again, look, you can see there's a shift happening in terms of ultramarathoning from tracks to road to trail to mountains. The first mountain trail ultramarathon in the US was the Mount Baker race. It was 50K and it was in Bellingham, Washington, and it was held in 1911. Now in 1926, an early ultramarathon took place in Mexico as part of the Central American Games, where two Tarahumaras Indians ran 100K from Pachuca to Mexico City. So again, while this is not necessarily US based, it's just right on the outskirts. So I mention it because it's super important because I do feel like Native American influence on ultramarathoning is substantial. And this just is another example. And then in 1928, there was the Boston Post Trail Race. And this was a significant 250-mile race that helped popularize trail running. So as I was mentioning before, like you see this evolution happening, but then with this race, it kind of now made trail running popular. You know, at first it was just getting a little bit of exposure to the race, but now it's like it's growing in popularity to the point where now people are creating these events. And notice it was a 250-mile race, y'all. We be complaining about these 50Ks, 50 miles, 100K, 100 miles. Woo, they was doing 250 back in the day. I'm not mad at them. And then you can see one of my videos I did earlier this week where I talked about the Great Bunion Derbies organized by C.C. Powell. C.C. stood for cash and carry. He was known to be flamboyant, and he did a lot of betting and stuff like that. And he always ran into a lot of money issues, but he was pretty good at organizing events. And in 1928, he created the Bunion Derby. Now, his derbies, he did the Derby in 1928 and he did in 1929. The first time it was from LA to New York, which was 3,455 miles. And then he did the New York to LA, and I believe he was either around 3,400 or 3,500 miles. And what's really interesting is like for the first race in 1928, like 199 people signed up, but then only 74 finished. And then in the second race, I don't remember how many, but it wasn't that many and not that many finished. But this really marked, because his ability to do this event back to back, year to year, it really marked one of the earliest organized ultra distance events in the country. Now let's move to the 1930s, where uphill races have started to gain popularity in the United States. It's not to say that there weren't uphill races before the 1930s, but then all of a sudden it got this kind of popularity. And it got popular based on the Pikes Peak Ascent. I know a lot of people know the Ascent race. This is the genesis of it, and the Mount Washington race. So again, uphill race, you know, there's one thing to do ultramarathoning, right? But then to add going uphill in a significant ascension is makes it even more challenging. I want to mention this next event. It's not exactly an ultramarathon, but it definitely was the impetus for more marathons in this country. It's called the Pikes Peak Marathon, and it was held in 1956, and it is known as the oldest continuously held marathon in the United States, and widely considered the most challenging marathon in the United States. And some even suggest that it includes an ultramarathon-like challenge because of its significant elevation gains. The race is, 26.2 mile trail run that starts in Manitou Springs, Colorado, and it ends at the summit of Pikes Peak. So, like I said, I mentioned this race not because it's necessarily an ultramarathon, but it's ultramarathon-like, and a lot of it has to do with the significant elevation gain and how the whole ideal of uphill races really started to explode in the ultramarathoning world. I want to talk a little bit about this marathon too, because the guy who this race has an interesting history, because the Pikes Peak Marathon has an interesting history because there was this guy, he was a doctor, and he was formerly Finnish from Finland, and where he did a lot of I guess he was a Finnish marathon champion. But when he was in his country, he created this race because he wanted to challenge smokers and non-smokers to race up and down Pikes Peak. Also, he held the race to commemorate the 150th anniversary of Zebulon Montgomery Pike's discovery of Pikes Peak. And then also his goal was to prove that smoking was harmful to health. So, wow, this is so deep that in the mid 1950s, not only does this guy create this race, but he does so for specific reasons around health, but more importantly, also to celebrate the discovery of Pikes Peak. So I think it's just kind of interesting. And then also, I wanted a couple notable history moments is that Arlene Piper became the first woman to finish this marathon in 1959. This race became so popular that an ascent-only race called the Ascent was created. Now, that's the early history of ultramarathoning in the United States up until the late 1950s. I'll stop here, and then on Monday, we'll finish up talking about the rest of the U.S. history, and I'll identify some milestones in ultramarathons that made the sport what it is today. Don't forget that you can visit our online community at school SKOOL.com, Ultramarathon 101, where you can hang out with me and other folks that are interested in digging deep and geeking out on ultra marathons. Um, Thank you so much. Take good care of yourself. And as always, I'll see you in the outdoors. Peace and love, family.